Good afternoon and welcome to this second part of our trilogy of Building Back Better, Learning Together, the KQ Conference 2021. Welcome, thank you for coming. I hope some of you have rejoined us from yesterday, which was a fantastic day where we thought about working together. I also want to thank British Land for their generous support, and without their support we couldn't have put this great conference together and all the fantastic speakers that you heard yesterday and that you will hear today. But today's theme is learning, and the KQ is pretty strong on learning. If we look at some of the numbers, it's very impressive. We have 14 higher education institutions, 21 cultural institutions, some 22 museums and galleries, 35 libraries and archives, 580 research scientists, 3,000 research institutes, 3,000 scientists, some nearly 14,000 academics, 100,000 students, and 180 million catalogued items, and that's in our libraries and archives alone. And we're attracting something like 10 million visitors a year to the quarter. But what I really want to say to you all is that learning just doesn't happen in many of those august and fantastic institutions that we have. Learning happens across our communities. So what we're going to talk about today is how that learning works in our communities. We know that the communities of the KQ are some of the most deprived in the country, but what we also know is there's a huge amount of talent and potential. And what we want to do is to create growth that allows us to develop that talent, unlock that talent, and realize their potential through a shared approach to learning and development. And indeed, today, after I finish here, I'm joining a Camden STEAM Commission for an ongoing discussion about how do we create that pipeline of talent so that we can build into the future, because we are going to see growth within the KQ. But what we really want to do is ensure that all of those communities in the KQ are able to access all of that learning, access all of that knowledge, and realize their potential. We had a fantastic example yesterday from Regent's School, who spoke to the conference fantastically after their youth board and posed some great questions in the session itself. We have a great range of speakers again for you today, some great sessions, and again, as I mentioned yesterday, we are really reflecting diversity in our panels and in our speakers, diversity of gender, diversity of cultural background and ethnicity, and even indeed educational background. And it's important that we make places for all of those people. Learning is something that, as said, it just doesn't happen in schools. And we have a challenge in a post-pandemic world where we've seen a lot of damage happening, potential damage to young people, particularly in education, missing out on their education. So one of the things we will also be exploring today is how do we deal with that? How do we enable those young people to catch up? And I think the answer lies somewhere in us creating a range of opportunities for people to develop at the rate which suits them. But at the core of this is how do we tap into and help every individual, every young person in the quarter realize their potential. So I commend today to you, as I said yesterday, do stick with it. It's going to be worth it. It's going to be action-packed, full of information, full of quality speakers. So please enjoy the rest of the day. Over to you, Bav.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks so much. And good afternoon, everyone, to the second day of our Future of Knowledge conference, Building Back Together. Thank you all for joining us on this lovely day. The weather is a bit patchy. Is it sunshine? Is it rain? Who knows? We might get a bit of both over the next 3 hours. Either way, I think people are gearing up for the big match this evening. So I hope this nice 3 hours session will get you all ready for the big game this evening. Before we kick off with our second keynote of the conference, terrible joke there. We'd like to present a short presentation produced by one of our partners called The Place. Located in the heart of London, The Place is a creative powerhouse for dance development that is leading the way in dance training, creation, and performance. One of Europe's most exciting, innovative dance spaces where artists from all over the world come to push creative boundaries, to experiment and to perform outstanding new work for audiences who expect to be surprised, inspired, and delighted. The Place is home to London Contemporary Dance School, a 288-seat theatre when it's open, which it will be soon, an extensive range of classes, courses, and participatory opportunities for adults and young people, and professional development programs for artists. Shift is The Place's senior youth dance company for young people aged 14 to 19 years. The company offers a high-quality dance experience for young people to make, create, and perform whilst maintaining an equal focus on the company's ethos to provide a friendly, safe, and supportive environment where every dancer is free to express themselves and grow in their creative and technical abilities. We're going to see a dance film made by Shift, which was inspired by the question, "Can you see what I feel?" The dancers explored movement relating to words describing feelings and played with how these feelings are witnessed through the screen. This film is a digital documentation of those embodied emotions, thoughts, and sensations. Here we go. Hi, that was absolutely fantastic. I hope you enjoyed that. Before we go on to our keynote, just also a quick welcome to the young ambassadors who are at the Story Garden, our young group of people who are going to be listening in on the conference, and at a later point they're going to be having their own little roundtable discussing the theme of the day, which is learning together. So big hi, welcome to all those young people who are meeting at the Story Garden right now. Now, our keynote speaker for today is Raymond Antrobus, MBE, who was born in Hackney to an English mother and Jamaican father. In 2019, he became the first ever poet to be awarded the Rathbone Folio Prize for his best work of literature in any genre. Other accolades include the Ted Hughes Award, the PBS Winter Choice, a Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award, the Somerset Maugham Award, and the Guardian Poetry Book of the Year in 2018. And in 2019, he became Jamaican. His poem, Jamaican British, was added to the UK's GCSE syllabus. He's a recipient of fellowships from Cave Canem, Complete Works 3, the Jarwood Compton, and the Royal Society of Literature. He's also one of the world's first recipients of an MA in spoken word education from Goldsmiths University. Raymond is an ambassador for the Poetry School and a board member for English Pen, an organization that promotes freedom of expression and literature across frontiers. His poetry has appeared on BBC Two, BBC Radio 4, The Big Issue, the Jamaica Gleaner, The Guardian, and at TEDx East End. Raymond, welcome to the Knowledge Quarters conference. I'm going to hand it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Bab. Hello, everyone. Good to be here. I just would like to quickly get a picture up of this man called John La Rose. I'm gonna dedicate my section to talk to this man, John La Rose, who was active in Islington and in the Camden Borough. He lived in Islington, but just on the edge of it. And something that he did, and his peers would include poets and writers like Andrew Sulkey, publishers like Margaret Busby, James Berry, Jessica and Eric Huntley, Michael Rosen, Dark as How. And I just want to kind of hold him up as someone who I look to as not just a inspirational poet, but also an inspirational teacher, who I have kind of, studied in my own way and tried to kind of model some of my own practice as both a teacher and a poet around him. So I'll come back to John La Rose in a second. So I thought that I would just begin by saying that, yes, I'm a poet, but I'm also a teacher, and those two identities they're not binaries, they're not opposites. To me, they are one and the same thing. There's no classroom I go into where I'm not a poet, and there's no stage that I step onto where I'm not also a teacher. And I'll talk a bit more about how I make sense of those two identities in a second as well. So I thought I would just kind of give you some of my own personal background and my own teaching, and actually how I got into poetry. So as I said, I was born in Hackney to a mother who was very kind of politically engaged and curious. And I guess, in fact, the grounding of this whole talk is going to be culture capital, like how wealthy we are in culture capital, and why perhaps I'm not sure if we are utilizing it in the most impactful way. When we're thinking about diversity, but also diversity of learning styles, as well as all the other things that come with that. So yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that growing up, I was not very academically accomplished, but my main privilege is having two parents who were engaged and rich in culture. I very much describe my upbringing as a working class one, and social housing. A mom who worked at the markets, she would make jewelry and she would sell them at Camden Market and at Camden Passage as well. And so markets and festivals and all this kind of thing has been a very much a big part of my childhood and my landscape there. But one of the things, and my dad came over from Jamaica, who at times while I was a kid, he was practicing Rastafarian, but that's also a tricky thing. I don't know how true he was to the Rastafarian religion, but he tried to honor it. And so I learned a lot, I'd say, about the Jamaican and the British histories and where they entwine through him. But what I do want to talk about is education, where it happens, why is it important? For me, I think some of the most valuable education I had began with my parents. So, and I had two parents who loved poetry. So my dad's favorite poet was a woman called Miss Lou, a patois speaking, folklore storyteller, Jamaican poet and performer. And he used to record tapes of Miss Lou. Anytime she'll pop up, sometimes she'll pop up in the BBC World Service or some like pirate radio station. They'll just have a snippet of one of her poems. Another poet that they might put on there is Jean Binterbreeze, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Benjamin Zephaniah, Mikey Smith. So there was all of this kind of wealth of cataloging in a way that my dad did, and he would record it on these tapes. And this is why I've got one of my dad's tapes tattooed on me here. So on this side of the tape, it was all of the poems that my dad used to record of the radio and of TV. And then on the other side of the tape, he would then give me the space for him to record my voice, trying to practice the poems, trying to recite the poems. So that on that tape, on the other side, it says Raymond speaking, and it's just him conversing with me. And so like, this is a very much kind of in the world of academia, in a kind of academic way, this could be modeled as culture capital and learning through culture capital. And now on my mom's side, my mom's favorite poet, there are two poets she would often talk about: William Blake, who doesn't know William Blake, and Adrian Mitchell. And I have quite a visceral memory when I was a kid, and this is before apartheid was fully lifted. So in the UK, we were still massively marching to end apartheid in South Africa. And so both my parents went down to Westminster Square, and they would have poets performing in the square. And one of the poets I remember seeing was a man called Adrian Mitchell. And Adrian Mitchell, his famous poem, one of his famous poems was Tell Me Lies About Vietnam. So I'm there on my dad's shoulders with my mom, and we're there involved in this protest to try and end apartheid and put pressure on the South African government to stop all of the racist regimes that were happening there. But again, I'd say that this experience is modeled through a idea of culture capital. I'm receiving the story of the moment and the times through a poem, through a performed poem. And so when we would walk back from these protests, my mom would also point out other places which were significant to other poets. So if we were, for example, walking across Westminster Bridge, she would say, do you know William Wordsworth wrote a poem about this bridge? Do you know T.S. Eliot wrote a poem about this bridge? Do you know Coleridge wrote a poem about this bridge? Do you know Blake had a poem about this bridge? Like a bridge built in 1740, I think it was built, between 1740 and 1760, becomes this almost like a meeting point in the landscape of our literature, of our canon. So this is where I'm thinking about how landmarks play a role in our education, but also in our storytelling, and how we understand our city, our surroundings, where we are. I'd just like to put up a picture of the plaques. I selected some plaques that are on view around the Camden Borough. So you can see here George Orwell, T.S. Eliot, Tagore, Paul Robeson, D.H. Lawrence, Dylan Thomas, Yeats, Virginia Woolf. Each of these names are huge stories and huge bodies of work, and really powerful, I'd say, culturally, powerfully and impactfully cultural capital. Because within each of these people, I mean, for example, Paul Robeson, and the whole story of Paul Robeson, if you know about him, being kicked out of America for being accused of being a communist, and living in the borough of Camden, where he went on to act here and sing here. George Orwell, who most of us will know, very much a big part of our education here. And then I was imagining this as a kind of realized version of what my mom was doing. So there weren't these plaques. These plaques weren't around when my mom was doing what she did. You know, my mom just knew the stories. For example, we walked past this house once. I can't remember exactly where it was, but I think we were walking towards Peckham. And William Blake has a poem about the angels of Peckham Rye, and she would point at the trees, and she'd say, William Blake saw an angel out by one of these trees. And just the things that did, the seeds that planted in me, because she was giving me stories. She was letting me into the stories, and she was allowing me to see the stories of these great poets, of these artists, of these writers, these figures. She was telling me that these are my stories too, you know, that we can find our way into them. And I would say that one of the things that people often talk to me about in terms of poetry, in terms of becoming a poet and practicing poetry and really embracing my identity as a poet, it startles people because they often think, well, how does that happen? And you know, what I mean, there might even be some English teachers on this call, so I want to be careful how I say it. But there's having gone into schools for the past 10 years and been a poet in residence in lots of different schools, in deaf schools, hearing schools, schools in Hackney, to schools in Athlone in South Africa. There's often a fear or a hesitancy around poetry. And for most people, I'd say, it seems that their first encounter with poetry is in a classroom with an English teacher, maybe trying to teach them iambic pentameter, the Shakespeare rhythm. And if that is your origin story for poetry, and that might really work for some people as a way in, but again, thinking about diversity of learning, for me, my way into poetry was the stories, was the music, was as well as the work, and was the landscape, the places, the sites. Another thing I would like to share or model, or maybe if there's some teachers or educators watching, is I just want to show these pictures of these writers, Sam Selvon, Dinah Evans, and Andrea Levy, 3 fiction writers who all have scenes in their novels set in King's Cross. So I was just thinking about that as well, and how we embed the kind of fictionalized lives of our people, of these characters, sorry, and how they end up in streets, in sites that are very real. And so these are just 3 examples of writers who you can read their books and you'll be able to find streets. I mean, and this is, of course, no one in the UK, probably no one did this more famously than Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens made such a massive impact on the cultural landscape of the UK, of London in particular, is that when you walk around Camden, Charles Dickens' characters, fictionalized characters, have plaques. So there are like places with like there's a house around near me that literally says the name of one of Charles Dickens' characters lived here. And so that for me is interesting, and raises this idea of what a kind of literal relationship with a landscape is, and what a spiritual or imagined landscape is, and how we can bring that in to our learning. So I just want to go back to John La Rose as well, because I'm just trying to throw kind of just examples of people that have really inspired me, and people that both I feel inhabit their identities as creators, as writers, and as teachers. So just to talk a bit about why John La Rose inspired me, what John La Rose did in the late 70s, 80s, through the early 90s, he noticed a problem, particularly with Black youth going through the British education system. He looked at the books, he looked at the textbooks, he looked at the things that they were learning about the history, or about British history. And then he looked at what the British curriculum was teaching them about Black history. And in this definition of Black, I'm going to also throw in, I'm going to extend that to South Asian, and almost any kind of anyone around that, even people from the Commonwealth as well as the former colonies. And so he, again, talking, because he's a poet, right? He understands the power of story, and he sees the stories that a lot of Black youth are being told about themselves and where they are from. And what he did is something very practical and brave of him. Him and his wife, whose name I did write down. I want to make sure I get his wife's name in as well. Sarah White. Him and Sarah White opened up their house to basically to young people of color. It was an open door for them to come into his house and take lessons. And John La Rose would sometimes have guests around as well. So like I said, some of his peers, some of other poets, other writers, and it would just be a conversation with them. And it might be one of the things that some teachers might know, some of the language. It could be like a democratic classroom, which is where it's not just the hierarchical order of a teacher, one teacher at the front who's just giving information for students to memorize. No, this is kind of active learning rather than passive learning, when we get to engage with the lives and the memories of the students, of the people that we're speaking with, and then we bring them into our cultural space, our classrooms, and we validate them, and we make that as much part of the curriculum and the learning experience as, say, reading Shakespeare or George Orwell. And I should also say that it was mentioned that I went to Goldsmiths and I did what was called a spoken word MA. But I feel like those words don't quite sum up what I did, because at Goldsmiths, I spent much more time learning about how learning happens and learning about something called emotional literacy. And so there are lots of kind of case studies that I did over the 3 years while I was at Goldsmiths, which I got to try. So everything I'm talking about now isn't kind kind of ideology. This is kind of tried practical work where we went in, well, me and a few other poets went into some schools, mainly around the places where we're from, where we're born. So I focus on schools in Hackney. And I went in as a poet, but also as I would call myself an emotional historian. And what that would mean is I would take an active interest in the lives of the young poets, of the students that I was meeting and working with. And I was allowing them to open up and tell me a bit about their lives at home, tell me a bit about what they know about their parents, even bringing in maybe other languages that they speak to their parents, which might be different to the language they speak to their teachers and their friends, and giving that a space. And one of the questions that I'd often ask at the end of these sessions, when students had kind of shared that or spoke about that and written about that, was who here has learned something new about someone in this room? And almost every time someone's hand goes up, and then that then becomes another conversation about, okay, great, so how do we bring in this new knowledge and apply it to, again, to our education, to what we're learning? I know I'm like grazing the surface of all of this. I just wanted to kind of get as much of this as I could. So I guess what I'll do now is I'll come to this point I was thinking of, where practically, how do we connect these grassroots strategies to meaningfully to a more stable and cared for infrastructure? And I'm very, again, talking about John DeRose, I'm very much in tune with the community, being community minded. So I just want to share some places in the Camden Borough which have been intrinsic, really important sites for me, where learning has happened. So the Poetry Society, there's the Poetry Cafe. This is the first place where I ever performed, no, the second place where I ever performed a poem. And I was invited down there on a Tuesday, and I found out that there was a poetry open mic. And I went down there, and I was an 18-year-old with, I'd just come back from work experience. I'd lived in America for 7 months, working with deaf and hard of hearing young people. And I'd been writing furiously over the months in the notebooks. And what I found out about myself while I was over there was that I wanted to be a poet. So I came back and started finding places where I could share my work. So here, the Poetry Society on the right, Poetry Cafe, was very much a genesis for me beginning my story as a poet. Now, some of the poets that I met in that building would then invite me to the building that's on the left. Now, Conway Hall, I'm sure there are people here that understand the cultural richness and significance of Conway Hall. I don't think you could name someone who hasn't spoken at Conway Hall, from Desmond Tutu to Winnie Mandela, to James Berry and Andrew Sulky, Margaret Busby, Jessica and Eric Huntley, Michael Rosen, Darcus Howe, all the people that I mentioned earlier. Conway Hall has been a landmark for radical ideas. I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, I was looking for it. I think James Baldwin also might have read there as well. So when I was invited into a place like Conway Hall, and because of the stories I'd known, because this was a place where my mum would have walked past and told me about the significance of that building and the history of it, I walked in immediately feeling like I was part of the story of a nation. I was part of the story of literature. I was a part of the story of the radical and important ideas of this country. It's a powerful thing. It's a powerful thing, just aligning your thinking with that. I think there are some other buildings as well. There's a slide, yeah. So not far from Conway Hill on the left, you'll see Houseman's, a radical bookshop. This would be the place where I first read books by Audre Lorde, the place where I would pick up pamphlets. I picked up C.L.R. James. I mean, so many. So just having a space like this, and again, remember, I'm from Hackney, so I'm coming out of Hackney I'm leaving my ends for this, right? And again, the reason I know about this mainly because of my mom. My mom would also be going there looking for books. I'd find some of her books sometimes. I say, where do you get this? It says, oh, Houseman's, go check it out. It's also, they also have a secondhand section downstairs where every book is £1. And then on the right, you've got the Quakers Cafe, a free public space which I've used over the years to meet friends, to meet other poets. I've been invited to do a talk once in this building. And again, when we think about the history and the significance of the Quakers and what we learned from them, yeah, really important, impactful, safe as well space for a lot of people, I'd say. And I think there's another building in Camden I want to shout out, the British Library. So the British Library, I mean, I think we all would have something to say about British Library as students, but again, British Library has been a place for me to write, to connect with other people, and their lending library has been amazing. And you know, it's not a place that we can also enter these spaces, understand them as institutions, and engage with them critically. You know, I'm not trying to kind of glorify anything about these spaces. I'm just in a way claiming them as important spaces that are part of my story as a poet, as a learner, as a teacher. So I think that I will leave it there. I know I've skimmed a lot of ground, but I know that we're going to do a Q&A now, I think, with that. So I hope, give thanks again to John La Rose. I hope some of this has provided some inspiration for you. And yeah, well, welcome to poetry.
Fantastic. Thanks, Raymond. That was a great sort of whistle-stop tour of the Knowledge Quarter, according to Raymond Antrobus. That was absolutely fantastic. You said you were a Hackney boy, but I know you're no longer a Hackney boy. You are now a Camden boy. You are, in fact, stone's throw from the British Library. I won't say what road you're on, but literally, I could, you know. So listen, what's it like now being in the area that you visited so many times, these places, these institutions? Conway Hall, which is also part of the Knowledge Quarter, British Library is part of the Knowledge Quarter. You know, how does it feel now to be in the heart of this area, and what does that mean for you?
And I think that's what I was trying to convey in that talk. Like it almost feels like coming home in this way, because I feel like my memories of some of these spaces and the people that are kind of associated with them, including all of the names that I just mentioned in that talk, had a presence here. So when I'm able to, again, to align some of my thinking and some of my ideas with people who lived in the same roads, you know, just found the corners, you know, I pass the plaque almost every day that George Orwell lived here, T.S. Eliot. And again, these aren't people who I'm trying to kind of glorify and say that they didn't have things that we can criticize, but it is for me just a kind of I don't know, I don't want to say homecoming, but a kind of invitation into their world, into their work, and I can walk the streets with them, you know.
Who are the unsung heroes of the area, Raymond? Whose blue plaques haven't you seen yet that you think deserve to be there?
Well, it's tricky because I know it's the Camden Borough, so I know a lot of for example, I would have liked to have seen more from John La Rose, but actually John La Rose lived in Islington. The same with Andrew Sulkey, who would have had a big presence in Camden. I'd have to look at that properly, but like, there's just so many names. I'd say that James Berry was the first Black poet to anthologize Black British writing. And he is, for me, as a poet, speaking as a poet, a name who doesn't get his due, considering so much kind of, so many things that have grown from his legacy and his contribution to the British literary landscape. I think it needs to be turned up louder.
Yeah. If you were to put your John La Rose hat on, Raymond, whose stories aren't being heard, and who would you open your door to let them into your living room?
If I was to put my John La Rose hat on, whose stories aren't being heard, and whose door would I open, or who? Is that again? Sorry, who?
And you know, the way that John La Rose and his wife opened their doors to people to come in.
Yeah.
What are the types of groups, organizations, or the groups of people in the local community that you feel their stories haven't been heard yet?
That's a lot. We would need more than a house. We would need a temple, you know. But I think that someone or a group who I would like to see more presence from are people from the deaf and hard of hearing community. It's only been since 2003 since British Sign Language has been recognized as an official English language, even though it's been called British Sign Language for its 400-year history. And I would like to see more people that have come out of SEN, Special Educational Needs Unit. So I came out of a Special Educational Needs Unit. I was assumed to be dyslexic with all kinds of learning difficulties. And then they found out that I was basically deaf. And so I got hearing aids. I mean, I was given loads of support. In fact, one thing that's quite amazing about being back here in Camden is Bart's Hospital and St. Joseph. There's a hospital which was one of the first hospitals I went to when I was around 6 years old, and had some tests basically to figure out whether my deafness was inherited or something had brought it on. So I think that I just watched the film The Reason I Jump. Is out now. I recommend anyone to go and watch that film. It's a beautiful and complicated film about autism, but something that can be applied universally. Again, thinking about diversity of learning in particular is, autism or deafness or dyslexia. These things are we just have to know more about learning styles, about the different people's ways of being. So my learning style, again, it was a complete accident. Like my mom and my dad, like just telling me these stories, standing me on Parliament Square and being able to talk about the significance of, not just the other people that had stood on that square, but also talk about, politics and the significance of Cromwell, Cromwell facing the Parliament and Churchill. You know what I mean? So all of these are like stories in stone. So I guess the other question that brings up is, our teachers, are our teachers equipped with these stories? Because I never got any of this from my institutional British education. I got it at home, and that's where I think my real wealth is, and my real knowledge came from.
Absolutely. We're running slightly over, but there's a question that's come from one of the audience members saying, how can we get young people engaged with poetry from a young age rather than through mandatory study in secondary school? So I'm sure you could talk about that for half an hour, but just a very quick response to that, Raymond.
So, I mean, like I said, don't just talk about the work, talk about the lives that they have lived. You know, my dad was very adamant in saying that Bob Marley was a poet, and the way that Bob Marley could be spoken about, not just as a musician and a storyteller, but also as a poet. So we would listen to the songs, and then he'd be talking to me about the lyrics. And then my mum would be talking about a William Blake poem, London by William Blake. And then she would say, what's the difference between Bob Marley's Redemption Song and William Blake's London? What's the difference? And actually there was so many parallels in terms of, in terms of engaging with the history, with people engaging with struggle, engaging with repression, engaging with poverty. You know, there's this, this is what I'm saying, like we are literally living on, I think, one of the richest cultural heritage sites, like places, not just being in Camden, but being in London. You know, if we can just sync up our understandings and our stories with the literature, with our lesson plans, you know, I think that there's a lot more open, a lot more other ways in to talk about poetry and art and people.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, look, thanks so much for that, Raymond. We're going to keep you on the screen because you're kindly going to be joining our panel. As you all know, the theme of the day is learning together. With more universities than anywhere else in the UK, the Knowledge Quarter is a centre for learning and skills. Sadly, the pandemic has had a shattering effect on young people in the labour market. Camden and Islington councils have set out next generation initiatives in response and have invited support and participation from local organisations in regard to youth employability, skills programmes, mentoring, virtual working opportunities, and more. How can the Knowledge Quarter work together to offer training and work experience across multiple businesses, encouraging local employment and essential engagement with local schools? Beyond apprenticeships, there is scope for significant outreach to the local youth population. And whilst the obvious focus might be in the later years of secondary education, there's also an argument for earlier interventions with primary school children. With the presence of several higher education institutions in the KQ, both big and small, how can we ensure that our education support and outreach prioritizes students from the lowest income backgrounds? We're going to look towards finding answers to these and other questions in our panel now, The Future of Learning Together. I'm delighted to introduce the speakers for this panel. We've already met Raymond and he's going to be sticking around. Josh Hillman is Director of Education at Nuffield Foundation. He leads the foundation's work in education, encompassing both research funding and student programs in STEM and quantitative skills. Josh was formerly head of education policy at the BBC, where he was responsible for development of education policy and partnerships with the BBC's output across media for children and adults. Josh was Deputy Chair of Governors at an inner London primary school for 5 years. The Right Honourable Lord David Willetts served as a Member of Parliament for Havant between 1992 and 2015, and as Minister for Universities and Science between 2010 and 2014, and has previously worked at Her Majesty's Treasury and the Number 10 Policy Unit. Lord Willetts is President of the Advisory Council at Resolution Foundation, a visiting professor at King's College London, a governor for the Ditchley Foundation, chair of the British Science Association, and a member of the Council of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. He's also an honorary fellow of Nuffield College in Oxford. His book, The Pinch, which focused on intergenerational equality, was published in 2010, and he's recently published another book called A University Education. Carol Homden, OBE, is Chief Executive of the Quorum Group of Children's Charities and also serves as Chair of the National Autistic Society and is a trustee of the Association of Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services and is a former member of the Youth Justice Board for England and Wales. Having started her career setting up print media enterprises in East Anglia, she moved to London as a freelance arts journalist and became the first public relations officer at the then Polytechnic of North London and Director of Marketing and Development at the University of Westminster. Our participatory chair for the session is Omar Salha, a PhD Nuhud Scholar at SOAS, University of London, and a lecturer in international diplomacy and soft power and British politics. Omar is also a fellow at the Royal Society of Arts and research fellow at the Islamophobia Studies Center at Berkeley in California. Omar is the founder and chief executive of the Ramadan Tent Project, an award-winning non-profit organization established in 2013 with a mission of bringing communities together to better understand each other. This is done through several of its key projects and programs, and notably the UK's largest cultural community event in Ramadan, Open Iftar, which I'm sure everyone has heard about. He's a regular contributor to many international and national print media, and he fluently speaks Arabic, Turkish, and English. Thank you all for joining this panel. Over to you, Omar.
Thank you very much, Bav, and good afternoon to all of our viewers and, of course, our distinguished speakers. It's a pleasure to have you all, and a huge congratulations, if I may say, and begin with, to the conveners and the organizers behind the Knowledge Conference. I think it's amazing to see so many wonderful contributions being made over the past day and a half, we can say, and for the next day and a half that we have left over these 3 days. Yesterday, the conversation and the day was focusing around the future of working together. Today, the future of learning together, and tomorrow, the future of growing together. If I may say so, not because that I am part of this panel, but I think the learning aspect of the three is, in my opinion, probably the most important, in that if we are not going to learn some of the past experiences, that we're unable to grow from them and work together as well. But of course, it's a cyclical process, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, to work, to learn, and to grow. And they all involve in us wanting to explore new ways of learning and working together. This panel will be focusing a lot on the importance of understanding the significant gaps and challenges that were faced under, of course, the current pandemic. And hopefully we'll be able to understand a little bit more from the expertise that we have here with us today about the key challenges, about the key ways for us to actually overcome those challenges, and of course the impact that COVID has had on the education sector, both in higher education, but of course young people and those preschool as well, which is a very important point to note. I understand we have a little under an hour, and I feel it's very important that we've got many here to offer their insights and expertise. So I think I'd like to begin with the first question, if I may, which is focusing on how can the Knowledge Quarter offer the training and work experience across multiple businesses, encouraging local employment and essential engagement with local schools. Of course, we have seen the universities in particular in this Knowledge Quarter, one of which SOAS is based in, of course, where I am connected with. Sadly, the pandemic has had a massive negative effect, particularly on those studying from home and joining us. So I'd like to begin with handing over to Lord Willets first for your contribution on this, and then we can move on to other guest speakers today.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to join you on this panel, and it was great overhearing what Raymond Antrobus was saying earlier. The Knowledge Quarter is fortunate in that it's already got a range of higher education institutions with a range of missions. I was actually in Central St Martin's only the other day. Of course, there's UCL, and probably very relevant for all this as well, there's Birkbeck, which does a fantastic job of reaching out to mature students. So it's got a range of universities with diverse missions. One starting point, which I think has suffered recently, is universities to recognize they have a civic mission. And even if they are in their research, they're collaborating with people around the world. I think a really good test for people involved in the running or doing research at any university is what we're doing in any way serving the square mile within which we physically are located? And looking at the other way around as well, are there within the square mile where we are located social and economic problems that our institution can do something about. So I think the square mile test is a very good discipline, however global the mindset of the institution. That's my first point. And my second point is that I personally do think that despite all the difficulties of delivering education during the pandemic, it has driven a shift to online learning and education technology that will not be reversed. We've seen more innovation in the past year than in the past 20 years. Initially, of course, some of it's pretty amateurish, and in the first stage of the digital revolution reaching any sector, first of all, you do exactly what you're doing before, but you record it and you stick it online, and you have a discussion like this discussion, which might a year ago have happened in a physical space. But it really gets interesting in the second stage when people realize they can use digital resources to do things differently and innovate in pedagogy. And of course, there will always be the physical interaction with teachers and fellow students, but I think we are now going to see significant innovation in how we are educated. One of the barriers, which was limited access to laptops and Wi-Fi, is still a problem, but the government has had a program of providing laptops for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, which is slow to gear up, but has now had considerable success. So we're making progress in removing that barrier. And I do think we are due to have a debate about exactly how we can use the data that is now available on how people are learning, where the education debate is way behind the health debate on patient data. There has to be an ethical framework. But in theory, knowing exactly from the keyboard how every individual learner is interacting, what is they are moving rapidly on, where they're getting stuck, what they're getting wrong, why they're getting it wrong, what they're interested in, is a fantastic resource. So some combination between a recognition of the roots of an institution in its square mile and boldness in innovating in education technology to spread access to education would be two things I would have at the top of my list.
Thank you very much for that, Lord Willett. I want to move over to Josh, if I may. I think a key point that Lord Willett mentioned there is obviously the digital innovation. And there was research conducted around the increasing gap between rich and poor pupils, which I understand the Nuffield Foundation also helped fund this research, which was done at Cambridge University, if I'm not mistaken. And I think I just wanted your feedback on that, and actually also just a bit about the increasing inequality between rich and poor students, and also the catch-up, if you will, in terms of how can the Knowledge Quarter in particular, but also how do we reduce that widening gap, particularly with the digital innovation that we are facing within the educational sector.
I really enjoyed Raymond's presentation, and a couple of things I picked up from it which are relevant to what you've just asked me. I mean, one is the importance of language right from birth, and it's clear that he had a very rich background in where language was absolutely central. And we'll come on to that because I think that's been an important sort of foundation of the problem that we've had, particularly during the last 18 months, is during a period of isolation with kids being out of school. But the other thing is that the area that we're talking about, the Knowledge Quarter, is an exceptionally rich area, and there's attention for all the institutions within it in terms of serving their local community, but also they're all national institutions that have, particularly with the use of digital technologies, the opportunity to enrich the experience of children and young people right across the country. And I think one of the things that we've seen happen in the past sort of 15 months in particular is that schools have cut back for a whole range of reasons, obviously partly to do with social distancing, but also partly because of prioritization in the face of the challenges that they've been facing on all of the sorts of enrichment activities that are provided potentially within the Knowledge Quarter. And so I think you have to look at it that way. Now, the research that we funded, which was looking at both what's been happening from the school perspective, but also in the domestic perspective during the course of the 15 months has shown a huge divergence between the experience of children within schools, depending on their social background, but also between schools in the experiences that they've been able to offer their children. And that wasn't just within the first lockdown. That's been a sustained issue. Even when schools haven't been locked down, they've been focused on helping pupils to catch up, dealing with social distancing, which has a negative impact on learning. We're just about to publish some research showing that the kind of one-to-one contact between teachers and pupils is inhibited by the need to have literally distance between them and pupils. The ability to give one-to-one feedback has been inhibited, and the practicalities of delivering all sorts of aspects of the curriculum, both in the core curriculum, but in the around the edges, for example, practical work in the sciences, bringing people like Raymond into the schools to help support and boost what can be provided by the teachers. All of that has been harmed. So what the research that we've funded has shown is that damage that has been done is not just for this particular cohort, but will have a sustained effect on pupils within the schools.
Thank you very much for that, Josh. And actually, on that point, and on building on the research, I know that we've discussed, and maybe perhaps even the attention has significantly been focused more so on secondary education. So I wanted to actually turn to you, Carol, a little bit on the importance here on the interventions within primary school and actually preschool, so early years as well. What has the impact you have witnessed or seen over the past 18 months? What more needs to be done to bridge that gap?
Well, hello everyone. Very nice to see you. I think to answer your question directly and then broaden out to the main questions, I would say that opportunities that you do not have as an infant, you do not recover. So your neurological development, it happens and must happen within defined parameters. And if you do not have the opportunity to be spoken to develop your oracy, to develop your numeracy, then you will be at a disadvantage throughout your whole learning experience. If you do not become an effective learner, then your chances of becoming an effective earner are very significantly reduced. What we have seen during the pandemic is in fact not the creation of issues, but an amplification of issues that we had already created all by ourselves. So before the advent of the pandemic, school exclusions were at their highest level ever. Autism was the single biggest presenting disability in education, health and care plans. There were more children being presented to children's social care than ever before. That was the situation before the pandemic. And the pandemic has amplified and accelerated those issues. Quorum has been working on these issues here since 1739. Looking at the trajectory of history, there is, of course, a vast improvement in access to education and to social opportunity in our society since Thomas Quorum established his charity to provide care for children who were illegitimate, abandoned, stigmatized, and felt unworthy. Thinking now around the Knowledge Quarter, it dismays me that the combination of organizations so far classified within the Knowledge Quarter does not include Quorum, which is an institute for the future of children and both research active and a deliverer of lifelong learning, or indeed any of the other major charities that are engaged in directly addressing the barriers for our children and indeed for our local communities. So that is, of course, the first gap to fill. And I'm absolutely with David, which is the absolutely crucial importance of civic responsibility, but also what I would describe as personal generosity. The keepers of knowledge must share that knowledge and give their time in the service of others. So I'm really excited at the opportunities for the Knowledge Quarter, perhaps not 1 square mile, but 10 square miles. And to become working in consort with organizations like Quorum and respectful of the kind of knowledge that we have, to fundamentally change the 3 R's, the reach, the relevance, and the results, as a movement of motivation. So you are most likely to become an architect if your parents are architects. You are most likely to go to university if your parents went to university. Who is it that each member of our 100,000 strong community of students is helping? To whom are you extending the ladder of motivation? So Quorum provides the largest youth drama festival in the world. What might you be doing to help? We provide 1,500 reading volunteers and reach 350,000 children a year in schools. As far as I'm aware, there isn't a single volunteer from within the Knowledge Quarter. We run accredited programs and have links with the universities, for example, of South Bank, Essex, and Newcastle, with accredited programs to increase the access to justice and legal information. When would UCL like to get involved? So I actually think the moment is now. The power is within our hands, and we need to put knowledge into action.
Thank you very much, Carol, for that contribution. I think in many ways, the question that we will get to is what are the key changes that need to be made. I think there are some really important recommendations that you have made. And I think I speak on behalf of Ramadan 10 Project as well. We would love to use this as an opportunity to actually engage with Quorum. And I'm sure the organizers at Knowledge Quarter would very much welcome that opportunity as well. So I think this is one of the joys of this conference, is the beauty behind convening and connecting people and looking at how we can, again, learn from different perspectives and actually look together to, as you say, put knowledge into practice. I'd like to actually build on some of the important points that have been brewing now around some of the headline sort of conversation points that Raymond, you were talking about earlier, which was cultural capital. And ultimately, the Knowledge Quarter, and I think we're all in agreement here, shares one of probably the highest concentration of soft power, British soft power in particular. Some of the world-leading institutions, the education sector, we know, of course, we're talking about learning together, are found in Britain. It is still, despite the obvious COVID pandemic difficulties and challenges faced, we still see several students and international students that I know of who are still keen and interested to come and travel to London in particular and study in some of the institutions within the Knowledge Quarter. And actually refer back to Albert Einstein's quote here, which is, knowledge is not in the learning of facts, but in the training of the mind to think. And I suppose this is what Carol, you were speaking about a bit earlier, around putting that knowledge into practice. So Raymond, I think, do we need a shift really? And I think almost the key word here was radical, maybe revolutionize the way we look at education. And maybe what was perhaps this pandemic almost an alarm bell going off and almost to sort of shock us into thinking perhaps we need to be more creative in the way we teach and almost more creative in the way we learn as well.
Yeah, that's a huge question, and I think so much of what's been shared here is just the beginning. Again, I feel like just skimming the surface of really deep, complicated issues. But yes, I advocate for obviously creative thinking, lateral thinking in our education. I'll just tell you, I'll tell you a quick kind of story. So I won this thing with the Ted Hughes Award a few years ago, and it was such a catalyst moment for me for so many different reasons. But one of them was being, in my first book, I'd come across this poem called Deaf School by Ted Hughes. The brief story of that is in the early 80s, Ted Hughes was asked to, by the National Theatre actually in South Bank, was asked, how do people live without language? So this was the question he was given. And Ted Hughes decided to go to a deaf school in London and just spend one day observing learning happening in a deaf school, in a deaf classroom. Just to bear in mind, Ted Hughes knew no sign language. He had never interacted with a deaf person, so he knew nothing about the very rich and historical culture that of deaf people which they have. So he's very much an outsider. But he's gone into this deaf classroom, and he ended up writing this poem called Deaf School, in which he compares the children to monkeys and to fish, and he says that they're simple. And I mean, I even put some of the words in the book, because when I read the poem, and again, I was someone who, Ted Hughes was one of the first poets whose collections I would read from first poem to last poem. And so Ted Hughes was someone, again, who was a big part of my culture capital growing up, and someone who I engaged, even his children's literature, the Iron Man, for example, all of these things. So it really hurt actually seeing this poem. So he says things like deaf children are alert, simple, lacking a subtle waving aura of sound, of responses to sound. And so what I decided to do in this poem was respond creatively to the gap in which, where Ted Hughes was coming from as a hearing person who doesn't know anything about deaf culture or deaf people, their language, and put this in a poem. So my creative response was to put the poem first in the book and just redact the whole poem, so you can still see the exact shape of this poem that it made. Then I took some of the images that Ted Hughes used and personified the Mississippi River. I happened to be in New Orleans while I was writing this poem, and I looked at the river, this huge presence of a thing, and just decided to speak as the river back to Ted Hughes. So I get the river to direct the same logic that Ted Hughes used back to him. So I say, Ted is alert, Ted is simple, Ted lacked a subtle waving or a sound of responses to sound, right? So that's the poem that comes after the poem. But when I go into deaf schools in particular and share this poem, one really powerful response I had from a deaf learner, a deaf student, recently had cochlear implants, 2 cochlear implants put in, and I showed him this. And I told him the story about Ted Hughes. He said, can you just turn the page so it looks like that? Sorry, so it looks like that. And yeah, and he said, oh, this looks like the screen of my audiologist when he is using the audio channels on my cochlear implant. And it was such a powerful moment because it offered an opportunity, a creative way in to talk about something which is hurtful and harming, but it shows, again, there are other ways to think about our relationship with information, with knowledge. So that was such a kind of one example of a powerful interaction I had, where everyone in that classroom, including the teachers, were able to chime in that discussion and learn something about about where Ted Hughes was coming from, about deafness and deaf culture, and then to create something that's very visceral and visual. So then again, talking about the diversity of learning styles, it just encompassed everything. And so after that particular session, they said, the students who were really quiet and often don't contribute to lessons were engaged. They wanted to know the story. They wanted to know more about Ted Hughes as well. So it's just, this is what I advocate for, and these are the ways that I try to find, the gaps in our classroom and in our learning and our thinking and in our language.
Thank you very much for that, Raymond. I think the underlying message here, ultimately, the key word is belonging. I think the power of being able to bridge between different communities, and of course that is within the deaf community and the wider community as well, in this example that you share, but also respectively within the Knowledge Quarter, the various different communities that live within this very rich quarter here is the key word is belonging, and creating a space where there is coexistence and co-creating, but I suppose also co-curating spaces where actually people can come together to design and look at design learning and actually education in that sense. So with that in mind, and I think some of the points that you mentioned here, and perhaps Raymond, you can share a little bit, and then I can hand over to Lord Willett as well. We spoke about the soft power of the Knowledge Quarter, and understand and appreciate and acknowledge there are several organizations, how big and small. How can we ensure that the education support and outreach does indeed prioritize students from the lower income backgrounds? What more can be done, can be put into place to try to address some of the earlier points that we discussed in the first round of questions around the clearly identifiable knowledge gap that has come about and it may be even exacerbated under this pandemic?
Just to say something to that, I guess I grounded this whole my keynote in culture capital because I wanted it to kind of show the importance of school trips, of school outings, of actually engaging in real time with the environment, because there are literally stories put in stone and on plaques on our buildings and all of that kind of thing. And from what I understand, I've gone into so many schools now and tried to arrange school outings and school trips, and I'm constantly just barraged with bureaucracy, and these trips don't happen. So one of the ways that it seems that culture capital is not being capitalized on in a way that it seems it's gone down. It seems that there are less school trips happening now. And I really want to say that we're just missing a huge opportunity there. But then given in the kind of talk about the pandemic, of course, that complicates everything. So I don't really know, and I don't understand why so many cuts are still happening as well. So even during the pandemic, I did a talk for, I know it's a different borough, but for Tower Hamlets. And I was meeting teachers there who told me that £4.5 million was cut from their special educational needs budget during the pandemic. 4.5 million. And I don't really understand where that money goes, or who's making these decisions. But my guess is the people who are making these decisions aren't people who understand things like culture capital, things like the need for diverse learning, and how complicated special educational needs as an umbrella term is. And so one statistic that's really stuck with me, and I'm not sure if this is still true, but when it was last conducted, this survey, 75% of people born profoundly deaf in the UK grow up illiterate. And so someone who's come out of a deaf school and interacts with that community, I can see the limitation that in terms of opportunities that are open to some of my peers, some people I've gone to school with, and how stuck they've been and how even more isolated they've felt during the pandemic. So I also want to just kind of give some voice to that as well.
Thank you for that, Raymond. Lord Willett, if I may cross over to you again, any sort of general points that you have with some of the stuff that you've heard, but also in respect to this particular point around education support, outreach priorities, lower income, bridging the gap. And of course, as we've seen in the past couple of months, actually, research has come out that longer hours at school will not make up just the catch up at school. We need to think of more creative solutions.
Yeah, and obviously the pandemic has exacerbated some of these big social and economic divides, and access to education, sadly, is indeed one of the examples of the effects of the pandemic. I think there are different groups who have been affected in different ways. A group I particularly worry about actually is teenagers, people in their late teens. I personally think, and when you look at public policy priorities, there's been a kind of protection for school budgets up to the age of 16. And despite the controversy around the 9K fees that I introduced, it did at least boost the money for educating students at university. I think 16 to 18-year-olds of a group who have never been protected by schools funding pledges and haven't been supported in other ways. And the transitions they are currently making out into college or apprenticeship or university are even tougher, big fall in the number of apprenticeships. So I would make them a focus of attention. I think secondly, and I'm sorry to come back to education technologies, but I'm a member of the all-party group on education technologies, and we've done some research into how they can help tackle the very problem you're asking about. And so one practical suggestion is there is, for example, quite a large pot of money for a tutoring program to help school students who have lost out by not getting proper access to schooling during the epidemic. But the guiding model is this is personalized one-to-one tutoring, which in turn has become a major supply constraint, holding back the number of students that can benefit from it. I think you should be more imaginative in having a blended option, where of course there should be individual contact, but also you can have well-targeted online education resources